Shalom, everybody. Today, today we are picking up our Romans Bible study in chapter 4, picking up in verse 9. But before we begin, let us start with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Mashiach Yeshua, v'hadabarat shel habarit chadashah. Baruch atah Adonai, noten habarit ha'chadashah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who gave to us the Messiah Yeshua and the commandments of the new covenant. Blessed are you, Lord, giver of the new covenant. Now, chapter 4, beginning in verse 9. Is this blessing then only on the circumcised, or also the uncircumcised? For we say, trust was credited to Abraham as righteousness. In what state then was it credited? While circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised, as he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness of the trust he had while he was uncircumcised, so he might be the father of all who are trusting while uncircumcised, the righteousness might be credited to them as well. Also, he is the father of the circumcised, to those not only circumcised, but also walking in the footsteps of the trust of our father Abraham before his circumcision. For the promise of Abraham, or to his seed, to become an heir of the world was not through law, but through the righteousness based on trust. For if those who are of the Torah are heirs, trust has become empty, and the promise made ineffective. For the Torah brings about wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there a violation. For this reason, it depends on trust, so that the promise according to grace might be guaranteed to all the offspring, not only to those of the Torah, but also to those of the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all, as it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he trusted, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence that which does not exist. All right. Once again, a heavy passage by the Apostle Paul. And in this passage, Paul argues that the physical circumcision is not a key advantage of the Jews. Instead, he emphasizes that their advantage is spiritual. Paul asserts that the righteousness that comes from trusting God is accessible to both Jews and Gentiles, and it predates not only the Mosaic law, but even the Abrahamic covenant. Circumcision was given to Abraham as a sign of his faith and a seal guaranteeing God's promises, but not as something to boast about. Therefore, Abraham is not only the father of the Jews, but also of the Gentiles who trust in God. And Galatians 3:6 through 18 and 13 through 22 below develop this theme further. See, in the Bible, circumcision was a symbol and validation of justification, serving as an external representation of the internal reality of the covenant. And the terms sign and seal were used interchangeably, with the sign pointing to and the seal confirming the reality of the covenant / justification. Circumcision was both the distinguishing mark and the confirming act of God's covenant with his people. However, it's important to note that both sign and seal were external to the covenant. Circumcision did not represent the covenant, but rather indicated it. Now, during Paul's time, Jewish leaders believed circumcision was the sign of the Mosaic covenant, but Paul argued that it originated in the Abrahamic covenant. He suggested that faith preceded and was the true essence of the law. Abraham was already justified by his faith when he was circumcised, and so circumcision was not the essence of the covenant, but rather a useful practice for it. which goes hand in hand with what I've said previously. Physical acts of obedience without the inward change are meaningless. It was Abraham's faith that justified him, not his circumcision. Circumcision was merely, I won't even merely, not merely, circumcision was the physical representation of that covenant, not the covenant or the cause of the covenant. No. So, Abraham was considered righteous by God before he was even circumcised. This means that he is the father figure of both those who are circumcised and those who aren't physically circumcised but still believe in God. Now, circumcision itself doesn't have any special power. It's a symbolic ritual that represents the covenant between God and humanity. The covenant is maintained through obedience rather through circumcision. This can be seen in verses such as Genesis 18:19, 22:18, and 26:4 through 5. If someone believes that baptism is the equivalent to circumcision in the New Testament, they should note that this comparison doesn't support the idea of baptismal regeneration. If circumcision by itself couldn't change a person's relationship with God, then the same would also be true of baptism. In the Christian circles, baptism is a symbolic act. It does not give you salvation. It does not make you righteous. It's the same thing with circumcision, and they are not the same thing. Paul believed that the only way for both Jews and Gentiles to be justified is through faith. God is the Father of all those who trust in him, regardless of their race or religion. It is not enough to simply possess knowledge of God. It is important to demonstrate to one's faith through conduct. So, as James says, faith without works is dead. Your faith, when not accompanied by actions, but your faith that does not, if it does not produce fruit, is meaningless, is dead. So I believe I mentioned it in the previous video. Paul and James do not contradict each other. Paul's focus was on the faith aspect, and James' focus was on the actions part, and those two go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. If you have works, but don't have the genuine faith, those works are not enough to count you as righteous. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there that believe that your works count towards righteousness, and they don't. Your works cannot save you. If that was the case, everybody would be saved, because even those who don't profess faith in God would be saved, because there are a lot of unbelievers who do a lot of good things for people. In some ways, they put Christians and other people who profess faith in God to shame with their works. But works are not enough. Works must be accompanied by true faith, and true faith must be accompanied by works. People often prioritize doctrine over behavior, but the knowledge of God's nature is only valuable if it transforms one's life. Without the transformed life, one cannot claim to have Abraham as their father or have a relationship with the God of Abraham. In this passage, Paul shifts from discussing circumcision to arguing that Abraham and his descendants did not receive their promise through the law. Now, this chapter can be divided into 4 stages. Faith, apart from works, in verses 3 through 8. Faith, apart from circumcision, in verses 9 through 12. Faith, apart from the law, in verses 13 through 16. And faith, apart from sight, in verses 17 through 21. In this section, the third aspect is most important, as Paul turns to the promise that God had made in the Abrahamic covenant. The key term that appears 4 times in verses 13 through 22 is promise, with the verb adding a fifth reference. The problem is identifying the promise which is not explicitly stated in the Abrahamic covenant. The covenant only mentions that Abraham would have descendants, be a source of blessing to the nations and inherit the promised land. However, it is likely that the promise is a summary of those aspects from the perspective of the universal effects of the coming of the Messiah. Abraham and his offspring would inherit the world through the victory of Christ over the world. In Revelation 22:5, it is said that the saints will reign forever and ever. The main point is that this inheritance cannot be achieved through the law, but only through the righteousness that comes by faith. This is in contrast to the Jewish belief that the promise given to Abraham were mediated through the law. No. The law is the guide. The law, the Torah, gives us a guide on how to live out our righteousness. It helps us, it's our guide to righteous living. It's there to convict us, it's there to correct us, it's there to tutor us, to guide us. All of it. It's not there to save us. The law cannot save you. The Torah was never meant to save you. It was there, it was and is still there to show us our sin, our sins, and also show us how to correct those sins. But it is not there to save us. Paul's main point in chapter 4, which we will finish up next week, is that Abraham serves as an example of how divine promise, rather than the law, is the sole basis for our salvation. Because that divine promise, rather than the law, is the sole basis for salvation. As stated in Galatians 3:18, but God in his grace gave it to Abraham through a promise. And John Stott explains this well. He says, law and promise are incompatible categories of thought. Law demands our obedience, while promise demands our faith. So we see my computer battery's dying. Plug it in real quick. Maybe. All right. I thought I had it plugged in. Apparently not. All right. So now, even though he says law and promise are incompatible, I don't necessarily agree with that. It is a fairly good explanation. But either way, what God said to Abraham was not necessarily obey this law and I will bless you. He also said, I will bless you, believe my promise. This is just as relevant today as it was during Paul's time. We have two opposing, not necessarily opposing, but two extremes. You have some that focus solely on the law, and then you have others who focus solely on the grace. You have people who focus too much on their actions, and too many people that focus on the grace aspect of it, as if grace and law are incompatible, and they're really not. I know John Stott says they're incompatible, but in reality, they're not. They are different, but they go together. Paul also states that the effects of the law is wrath, or God's anger towards sinners. Now, at first, this may seem unfair. Why would God create something that causes wrath instead of salvation? However, this is not the right way to look at it. God did not create the law to pour out wrath upon humanity. Instead, he gave it as a means of maintaining a right relationship with himself. It is our guide. It helps us know. Not only does it help us know God's will, it gives us the exact blueprint on how to live God's will. Now, however, people are, you know, they are, we are unable to keep the law perfectly, so we fall into sin, which produces wrath. Paul's use of a legal argument to explain this is this: where there is no law, there is no transgression. The purpose of the law is to identify transgressions, or one of the purposes of the law is to identify transgressions. Now, Fitzmyer observes this by saying the prescriptions of the law, because they are not observed, produce transgressions, and so promote the reign of sin. This leads to God's wrath upon the sinner. If there were no law, there would be no way to identify what constitutes a transgression of the law. However, God did give his law, so there is transgression, which refers to the violation of specific written decrees. It's important to note that Paul does not say there is no sin without law, but rather that those sins cannot be identified as transgressions. From this standpoint, God's wrath is not simply his anger against sin, but his judicial wrath against the transgressions of his law. This is a more serious situation. Sin in general does not bring about God's wrath, but it is not a deliberate transgression, since the laws have not, correction, sin in general does bring about God's wrath, but it is not a deliberate transgression, since the laws have not been given. Once God's law is revealed, however, the sin becomes deliberate and therefore more serious. Keep that in mind. Now, in verse 13, Paul introduces his main point to that the divine promise to Abraham and his descendants did not come through law, but rather through faith. Then in verse 14 through 15, he explains the negative side of this point, that the promise did not come through law. Now, in verses 16 through 17, he represents the positive side, that the promise came through faith. The law is insufficient to produce the promised inheritance, so the promise must come through faith. This idea goes back to Abraham in Genesis 15:6, which is also mentioned in Romans 4:3. Abraham believed God, and it was credited him as righteousness. Just as Abraham attained righteousness through faith, his descendants, both Jews and Gentiles, can also attain righteousness in the eyes of God through faith. The reason for this divine requirement is that salvation may be by grace, which is a concept introduced in Romans 4:4, and again later on in the previous chapters. This emphasizes that the divine aspect of salvation. Salvation is made possible by God's grace, and people participate in it through faith. Human effort cannot bring about salvation. It is entirely the work of God on the basis of his grace. Now, as Bruce explains, what God provides by his free grace can only be received by people through faith. What is earned through works is given as a matter of merit, not grace. Now, the promise made to Abraham is guaranteed and confirmed not only for the Jews, but also for all of his offspring. The promise is absolutely certain to be fulfilled and applies to everyone who comes to faith in God, including both Jewish and Gentile believers. To sum up the first 3 chapters of the Bible, Jew and Gentile are equal in both sin and salvation. It is of no value to be a physical descendant of Abraham or to observe the law unless accompanied by faith, which alone can be credited as righteousness. Through faith, the Torah is established. as Paul puts it. Do we make void the law to this faith? No. We uphold it. We establish it. We confirm it. That is the only proper way to live it out. If you're not, you could you can observe the Torah all you want, but if you don't have the faith to back it up, it doesn't mean anything. Only then can Abraham truly be the father of us all, as both Jews and Gentiles approach God's throne by faith. On the positive side, this means that all people have an equal opportunity to come before God. Birthright and actions cannot earn salvation. And all sinners are called to God on the basis of Messiah's sacrificial atonement, and all can respond through faith. Human pride often causes people to desire to earn salvation through works or pedigree, but accepting it by faith as a grace gift goes against this desire. Concluding this section is a description of God in whom Abraham believed. To do this, Paul presents two descriptions of God. Firstly, he describes God as the one who has the power to bring the dead to life. This is in reference to the promise God made to Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child in their old age. This power is seen most clearly in the resurrection of Yeshua, as mentioned in verses 24 through 25. Secondly, Paul portrays God as the one who can call into existence things that don't yet exist. Now, although this could be seen as a reference to the birth of Isaac, the use of a plural participle suggests a broader context. Essentially, the point is that God doesn't just speak of things that don't exist as if they do, he actually speaks them into existence. This concept is also discussed in Hebrews 11:3 and 2 Peter 3:5. Ultimately, the idea is that as the creator, God brings into existence everything from nothing, which is a true creation and not mere adaptation. God is the only source of salvation. He's the only one that can create everything from nothing. Our pathetic human attempts to live out, to use our own works to try and gain salvation or to create things, if you will always fail. Only God can save, and only through his Torah can we live out that faith correctly. Now, we will end it there for this week. Before we close, we'll get just close with a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu hadavar ha'amet, v'chayei olam nata b'tokenu, Baruch atah Adonai noten habrit chadashah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who gave to us the word of truth and planted everlasting life in our midst. Blessed are you, Lord, giver of the new covenant. Thank you for joining me in this study. I'm looking forward to continuing it. I hope you all have a blessed week. Shalom.